Welcome to B&W Insights. I am your host, Mark Siefert, and today we sit down with transportation engineer Ryan Wallace. We dive into ADA transition plans, PROWAG, and how their team works together to make your walk down the sidewalk safe. Ready? Let's get started.
Ryan, thank you so much for coming down and joining us today. I'm excited. I get to learn today. This is a totally new world for me. I want to start and just find out, how did you get into this world of transportation and really dive into ADA and PROWAG?
Transportation in general has been a topic I've been interested in for a long time, so studied it in school. ADA in particular, I lived in Chicago for a while.
Okay.
And so growing up in a very suburban environment and then moving to a very urban environment and had a car but relied on public transportation, and the bike network was starting up at that time, and buses and things of that nature. So being a pedestrian most of the time kind of sparked that interest. And then moving from Chicago to the Milwaukee area and to a in-between suburban and urban environment, wanted to keep that interest alive and started to study more in that and started to do more specific trainings in that area. And a couple of years ago, I started, it's changed names, but it's currently called the ADA Coordinator Certification. So not just learning about the partitions of ADA that's applicable to me in transportation, but ADA as a whole and how it impacts.
So I find it really awesome that you kind of got into this because you were living. And that sometimes makes the best, you can't teach unless you know, but you were living it, so you had to learn it, it makes that transition from, teaching it and doing it and learning it so much easier when you're walking down the street. You can say, oh, this is why this code's like this. This is why, how this law applies. For us non-engineers in the room, there's non-transportation engineers in the what is ADA and what is PROWAG? I know we're going to use those two acronyms a ton today, so can you give us a high-level overview of what are they, when did they start, and really where they encompass?
Yeah, so ADA is the overall law that governs accessibility. So that was signed back in 1990 and then revised in 2008.
Okay.
But that covers a lot of things. And then in particular, there are specific standards that are geared towards the built environment. So as a part of that revision in 2008, they created what are called the 2010 standards as it relates to ADA. Then as an industry, we realized, hey, that is dealing with the built environment in terms of buildings and how those things are accessible. And those rules and guidelines don't apply very well to our built environment in the right-of-way, and specifically sidewalks and crosswalks and things of that nature. So it was identified pretty early, like that's a gap that we need more things on. So they worked on what is the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, PROWAG. And they worked on that for some time to get that right. It's gone through multiple revisions. We've known about it this whole time, but they finalized that in 2023. So as it relates to like EPA rules and those kinds of things, the EPA has a law, but then there's a rule that they institute. That's how PROWAG is. ADA as a law has been around for a long time, but then they created this rule which has to go through the specific federal guidelines in order to determine and whatever. So that process was finalized in 2023 as it relates to PROWAG. And PROWAG is for that built environment in the public right-of-way.
So the actual ADA, as we all see it through, as we're going to the grocery store or shopping,
We see ADA accommodations all over our world. That was 1990. I know in the PROWAG world, this is almost in its infant stage. How long is it the timeline to catch up or to get things involved? Or what does that law look like? How long does a community who is building a new road, I assume all new has to be built. What about stuff that's already built?
It's actually not in its infancy. We've known about this for a long time.
Okay.
It's really just a clarification. So none of the laws as it relates to any of this stuff has changed in a very long time.
Right.
It's just our understanding of those laws. So when the law is somewhat vague that you need to accommodate these people, Then the question is, how do we accommodate them? So the standards by which we've lived by have been updated. And we've known about PROWAG for a long time. We've just been awaiting its official decision. And as professionals, we kind of had to assume they're gonna adopt this, so we need to act accordingly. So we've been designing under PROWAG, as it were, for the better part of a decade. Now we're just getting these final implementations of the final rules. There's been some slight tweaks, but not enough that like, oh, this is some brand new thing. It's just, okay, we need to slightly adjust this, and it's not called a level landing, it's a turning space, and those kinds of things. So it's been minor modifications of late.
So to the average listener, the average pedestrian, they're not going to see a huge change. Whereas when other rules or things come out, you say, whoa, when did this change?
Correct.
This is more just clarification and making sure that every community, everyone building something, any person who's designing anything that has to do with the pedestrian walkway in the right of way is doing it the same way across the country.
Correct. Yes, it's both the government and professionals in this industry came together and be like, we need some clarification so that we can fully understand how to do this properly. That's what instituted the creation of the PROWAG guidelines.
And looking at other sectors, when government and the private side usually don't come together too often. So to have that collaboration is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's not even as much of a collaboration, both just collectively identifying a need of like, hey, we want to be able to comply with this law, but based on how you've set it up, we're not sure we're able to do that. And the law is so vague that it's like, well, how does that apply here? How does that apply here? And then getting those set of guidelines to be more specific on, okay, we need to be doing these very specific things. So because that's now created, most engineers in the transportation field will focus on PROWAG, and they'll somewhat forget about a lot of the laws that guide it because we only need to know about those specifics and making sure we're implementing it.
Well, that's awesome. So, when we're talking about designing in the right of way, there's obviously challenges. Sidewalks and ramps seem so simple. You're walking along, there's, you're walking straight. It's a sidewalk. How hard? It's a straight line. Draw a straight line. For us non-transportation engineers, from here to here, draw a straight line, there's your sidewalk. But I feel like there's a lot more to it. What makes sidewalks and ramps so complex for you as you are looking at ADA and PROWAG and all the things that go into it?
It is a extremely complicated area of design for us. With a lot of projects in transportation, especially if we're not widening or making significant modifications to that roadway, if we're just resurfacing that street, that's a very simple design. The engineer doesn't need to do a lot other than make sure, is this asphalt the right kind of asphalt? Do we have enough? Those kinds of things. We can do that very quickly. But the ADA law says that when we modify that road in that way, everything else around it also has to be brought up to the current standards to the best of our ability. And that built environment may not be ready for that in the way that we would have hoped. And the biggest challenge is that corner where everything intersects, the sidewalks intersect, the streets intersect, the curb intersects. That's where everything happens. 9 times out of 10, there's a drainage structure right there.
Right.
So can that drainage structure stay? Does it need to be moved? That's where that telephone pole happens to be. That's where that fire hydrant needs to be. So there's almost always something in the way. And ADA and PROWAG are a sliding scale of standards. So if you are just repainting a parking lot, you just need to get the right number of spaces for the ADA. If you're rebuilding that parking lot, now all the slopes have to be correct, right? So it's this sliding scale of, depending on the scope of the project, that determines the scope of how those accommodations need to be built. So every job is unique because the scope of this project, we need to match the accommodations to it. And then there's, within the law, we have to build things to the maximum extent feasible is the terminology, which means sometimes it is literally not possible, and we just have to document to say, hey, we did everything. We chose that we're going to sacrifice this little bit to make these other bits as best as we can. And at some day in the future, when we rebuild this road in a different way, we can come back and address those then.
So in the Midwest, we're kind of lucky where most of the terrain is pretty flat. I, for one, live on a hill, so I don't have sidewalks in front of my house on half the street because what we were always told was it's such a slope, you'd basically every front yard would have a retaining wall. How in you get into those situations where you get outside the flatlands of Illinois, Wisconsin, you get into some of these other areas where there is river valleys, there are hills. How does that slope really change how you design?
Yeah, and that just introduces more challenges. You're going to be dealing with more areas where maybe it's not feasible to build it to the degree that you want. One of the significant things that why PROAG was created is there are very strict slope guidelines if you're dealing with a built environment. If you're at the city hall, you don't really get a lot of those exceptions. But when you're on a roadway, they've said if the roadway is at 10%, the sidewalk gets to be at 10%. We don't have to build all these crazy ramps and stairs
Right.
and things of that nature just because we're along a roadway. So that exception helps a lot. But then if this 10% roadway then intersects with a roadway, how do those things interact? It becomes a big challenge. Like I said, it's a sliding scale, so there's no requirement within ADA or PROAG that says you have to have a sidewalk, but it says if you build one, it does need to comply with these sorts of standards.
And as we look into, I know the slope has a lot to do with people with mobility issues and wheelchairs and things of those nature. Then we get into your intersection, like you were talking, and we get into detectable warnings. Can you talk a little bit? What's their main purpose? How are they laid out? How, for the people who don't use them,
Right.
and really it is more you just see them. Go into that a little detail of that.
Yeah, detectable warning field is, I think, the term we use most commonly here in the Midwest, but it is a form of detection. It is someone who has vision impairment and who is not able to see that new roadway. If they're using a white cane and they come upon the street, it allows them to detect, hey, there's a change. I'm entering a new environment. So that one is primarily a vision thing. And those bumps in that particular pattern, that's a very standardized thing. It needs to be a specific way, allows them to detect that. There are alternate forms. It's really just a detection. Some people think that it orients them, but it doesn't. There are other forms that do that. There are edges that have like a little groove in them, and that can direct them in a specific way. And we might start to see more of that. That's used in other places a lot more. Europe has different guidelines in terms of their accessibility, but those orientation strips are used a lot more. But detectable warning fields, those are for people with vision impairments to let them know that there is an edge here that you need to be aware of. You're no longer on the sidewalk, you're exiting sidewalk and entering a different environment.
And as we talk about, you're entering that different environment. And that leads me, a few episodes ago, we had Jason Fleur down here to talk about roundabouts. So if you do have any good roundabout jokes, this is your time. Jason knocked us out of the park with one.
I think he stole all the roundabout jokes that we have.
All
so
right.
it's
Yeah, I'm
an
sure he has a
industry.
book for him. So, but as we looked, after that episode, we had some feedback and we were talking about it. If we're not stopping the traffic, what challenges are there for pedestrians, especially those with visual impairments, that roundabouts create? And then how does ADA and PROWAG then kind of help you guide towards those?
Yeah, so there's a whole set of guidelines in PROAG that says this is how you do things. And then there's a giant set of exceptions that says, but when you're in a roundabout, you have to do these additional things. So if you're at just a standard intersection, the detectable warning fields at those curb ramps is kind of the extent of what you're doing. But when you're at a roundabout, you need significantly more. So a true roundabout needs to be built with edge detection because of the sounds of that roundabout going in all directions. It is difficult for a visual impaired user to determine and orient themselves relative to those sounds. They can hear the traffic going one way, they can hear the traffic going another way at a standard intersection. Without them moving and going in a circle, they can't detect those things. So you have your standard openings where we've determined crossings, but up and around those crossings, we need to have edge detection so that they don't go walk off in some other direction because they can't tell by those sounds. So there are some significant benefits and some significant downsides of roundabouts. A significant improvement is you're limiting those crossings to specific areas. In general, you're only listening for traffic in one direction, but you have to be able to get those users to that point.
Right.
And that's the bigger challenge, is getting them to where they need to be and then orienting them after they've crossed that intersection.
And as we talk about, we're trying to get the user to one spot, but is there any emerging ideas or design solutions or technology out there that's helping through this?
A little bit. Like I said, in a built way, we can use those orientation strips. That helps a lot. The law says you need to do things in a specific way. For instance, you need to have non-visual means to accommodate someone. So you can't just put up signs. So currently, a good example is temporary pedestrian accommodations. If you're tearing up that road, you still need to be able to accommodate all the pedestrians through that area in some way. It's not very specific on how you do it. They don't care, just as long as it is equal to whatever's there now. And it has to include non-visual means. So the current way we know how to do that is we're going to provide auditory. So that means when you provide a pedestrian detour, you can't just put up signs that say, go this way, then go this way. You also need to have something that says to that person, you are at this intersection. The sidewalk is closed ahead. Turn right on 3rd Street. Proceed for 2 blocks. Then turn left. And that's that part of it. It's been in PROWAG, but we've all kind of, as engineers, collectively ignored that portion of it. And the states and government agencies are now saying you need to actually do this the way that it has been law for some time. You has said you need to do it. So we're seeing that as an area as us as engineers implementing that has been a challenge. So that includes sensors that detect, hey, there's a pedestrian here. Now we need to tell them that message. We need to have those at every point along that pedestrian detour. And that's one way we've determined to do it. But people are now wondering, well, it just has to be a non-visual means. So those orientation strips, maybe those are cheaper and easier, and we can place those at strategic locations to let people know about this detour. And maybe that's easier for both us as engineers to design and for the contractors to implement in the field. So the law is clear on what we need to do, but how we execute that moving forward is to be determined on some of those items.
So that's really a balance between safety, traffic efficiency, and accessibility at really complex intersections. And that's something that you guys as engineers are really trying to, balance all three of those. And how do you balance that? How do you really, are you trying to, look at, what's the safest way to get the most cars? Or is it, hey, we need the cars and I know when we talked to Jason, it was, drive for zero.
Vision zero. Yeah, of course. I personally do not design many of the intersections. I'm all the periphery items associated with that. And given my pedestrian focus, my number one goal would be safety, period, end of story. Everything else is secondary to that. Both the safety of the people in vehicles and the safety of people outside of vehicles. And so I would say let's make any and all decisions we have to make that make those things paramount. If that means that someone in a vehicle happens to have to wait 5 seconds longer, but we're all significantly safer as a result, let's do that. As Jason mentioned, roundabouts convert deadly crashes into ones that are just, we have to pay some money to repair our vehicle. That's a trade-off that I think we're going to make 1,000 times out of 1,000. Right. So those kind of decisions, I think, are the key things at intersections. So the goal is to just make sure that based off of the scope of that project, we are accommodating the pedestrians to the maximum extent that we can. And sometimes that means, hey, you're going to have to move. This is a brand new intersection. You got to move your traffic signal back like 4 feet because I need room. This is the place where the crossing needs to be. We need to accommodate those things.
So it's always a kind of a moving target and moving everything you're doing to really accommodate. And as we move into the next topic of policy and enforcement, the Department of Justice has signaled that communities could lose federal funding if they can't demonstrate ADA compliance progress. Is that a serious risk that a lot of communities are facing? Is that one of those things that the government's saying just to get us to move faster? Where does that fall? And what have you seen in the field?
Yeah, so the ADA law is a civil rights law. So the vast majority of it is enforced by the Department of Justice as a civil rights law. There's a small portion of it that the DOT has enforcement over, but that's related to transit on a larger level that doesn't impact a lot of the communities we work with. So yes, it is the DOJ that enforces that. And in reality, it's not a threat of losing funding as much as it is civil rights enforcement. And the way that that's played out is since the beginning, the enacting of ADA law, the best example is communities are required, if you have above a certain amount of employees, you have to create an ADA transition plan that says, we looked at everything that we have, and this is where we're at, and this is what is going to take to get there. And there was no requirement in the law that says you have to do it within a specific time period. They didn't care. Just make a plan and follow your plan, and every once in a while check in on your plan and see how things are going. However long it takes you, that's fine. Just have a plan, execute on that plan. Some people fell behind, chose not to do that plan at all. They found to have numerous violations. And so the DOJ came in and said, you guys are clearly not doing enough here. And they were given consent decrees that basically said, you now have 5 years. I don't care what you said you were going to do before. The consent decree says you have 5 years to do all of it. And they're not able to complete it in 5 years anyway. But the DOJ is then basically on their back constantly being like, you're not showing progress. We expect to see 300 curb ramps replaced a year. Right. So the threat is basically the DOJ coming in and saying, instead of you deciding how long you would like to do this and spreading that cost over, we're going to decide for you. And, it's not necessarily that you're losing funding, but that funding that you had earmarked for something else, you now have to use it towards this endeavor. So that's been the biggest DOJ enforcement as it relates to access within the public right-of-way. There's a lot of other DOJ enforcement as it relates to ADA law because that has to do with employment and public accommodations in restaurants and all sorts of other things. And there's constant enforcement on those actions. But as it relates to within the public right-of-way, that it tends to be the largest enforcement. And it comes from two different ways, right? It's a civil rights. So normally it is a citizen saying, I'm not being accommodated here. What needs to be done? And the typical process, that goes to the community and says, you got fix this. And then the reason the DOJ gets involved is they didn't fix it. So if a citizen comes to a community and says, you need to fix this, that's when they really need to jump on it.
To get on it.
Yeah, exactly.
So when I drive around a community as a water guy, I look at hydrants, I look at, where things are placed, and it's just natural for me. I'm always looking, when I'm on vacation, I snap pictures of fire hydrants, and it's just, when we're into your profession, that's what you do. For you, I assume when you're driving around, you kind of notice things. And if you could make a top 2 or 3 list of deficiencies that you see in communities when you're driving around, what are those things that you see most often that are PROWAG guidelines of like, oh, they should have been doing that?
Yeah. I think it's not when I'm driving around. It's definitely when I'm walking.
Good. That was your first test because you should be paying attention when you're driving.
And it definitely falls into the category, unfortunately, of the spouse of an engineer having to hear about the details of an engineering topic that they're not interested in at all. And that happens with curb ramps. And I've learned to just say that's not compliant, and I get to at least voice that out loud, and that satisfies that itch inside me. And then my wife is satisfied that I'm not going to go any deeper than that. But yeah, you normally see someone who is attempting to rush and finish this. When curb ramps are being constructed, there is multiple landings and turning spaces. If you try and build that all at once in concrete, you can tell. And then it doesn't work as well as it should versus they need to do that over 2 or 3 days. So that's a particular one. Another challenge, something that's kind of an interesting side effect of this is what has been known as the curb cut effect. So this law was instituted to allow people with mobility challenges to get around in the world. And that is who is the target audience for this. But there's a side effect that everyone else benefits from this. So as a parent, as you're walking around your community, it is significantly easier to get that stroller around your town because of all these curb cuts. They weren't made for people with strollers. That is not the intended effect. If you are a person with a child in a stroller, you cannot make a complaint to the DOJ if the curb cut is not proper, but you are significantly benefiting from that. So I do notice a lot more of those as, when my kids were young and I'm trying to push a double stroller and I'm starting to veer off into the street because the slope is excessive. You're like, well, I probably need to fix this. So those are other things that you notice out in the world when, I'm using it as intended for me. It needs to be made even better for those with accessibility challenges.
And a curb cut, for those who don't know, when we were growing up, you'd use the ramp when you're on your bike as from the curb and gutter. You use that to pop a wheeler or something, but now those are all gone because they're actually smooth, so you can get the wheels over.
Correct. Yeah, the intention is to transition the area between the sidewalk and the street that allow those users to cross the street. And wheelchair users obviously cannot just jump that curb like you could do on your bike. So we need to ramp that down to the street level.
Talking about going back to transition plans, and as communities are working through it. And we know that they have to get it done. They have to work towards it. What are some misconceptions that communities have about these ADA transition plans?
It's a great question. And I recently came across probably the best answer to this, dealing with a community in Illinois and Florida separately saying the same thing, that they're afraid that if they identify all of them, that they're going to have to fix all of them. Because that is generally the liability that is assigned to a municipality, is if you know about it, you are responsible to fix it. That's not really the way ADA law works. You are responsible to know all of the areas that you have in deficiency. And then you have to have a plan to address it. But if that particular area, this specific corner, we've identified it's not quite right, and we'll have a plan to address it, but it might not happen for 5 or 6 years. You're not responsible to go fix that today because you've now learned that it is non-compliant. There might be an exception if that user within your community says, my bus drops me off here, I work here, there is this deficiency in between, and I need you to address it so I can get to my place of work. That's a different story. Like, you have been specifically told that this specific instance is a barrier to them accessing their, being able to access their work. You need to fix that immediately. But just generally knowing all of the deficiencies within your community does not make you liable to then have to fix them all immediately. You know what it is. You're able to then create a plan to address them. You should be responsible in prioritizing the areas that, hey, we have a lot of people who walk in this area. Let's prioritize fixing all of the deficiencies in that area first. That might mean that there's a known deficiency in another area that's not going to be addressed for a while, but that's fine so long as you have a plan and you're executing on that plan.
And as we look at the collection of that data and the collection of all those areas, have we done anything to automate and gather that information?
Yeah. So the old school way is to literally walk every mile of that sidewalk. You put an old school level down and you measure down and do the math. That's evolved over time. Obviously, we work with some great GIS professionals and we can input that data faster. We now have digital levels that can tell you that information a little bit faster. But we started to work with some vendors that can utilize the capabilities of a lot of the technology that's around us. The newest iPhones and iPads have LiDAR sensors in them. So we have the capabilities to basically walk around with one of those, and that gets us planning level estimates of what's going on. It's not going to tell you that your slope is either 2.1 or 1.9 and know the difference between those, but it's going to say this one's about right, this one looks off a little bit, and that one's not even close. It can tell you, hey, your sidewalk's supposed to be 5 feet, but we're veering off and there's a barrier here, whether that is from a hydrant or this person hasn't trimmed their landscaping and so it's impeding on the walkway. So it can get you a lot of that data very quickly. And then the biggest challenge with that is now we have that data. How do we then parse that data, prioritize that data, and create plans to address that data?
So it's taking away, I'm sure, back in the, a few years ago, we were hiring interns and summer help to say, hey, your job is you're walking a mile a day.
Correct.
Now it's just your standard iPhone has LiDAR technology.
We're still asking them to walk a mile a day, but instead of having to measure every little thing, they're getting most of that information passively and being able to double check that. And then that means that most of our hours to do this has now shifted into the now what do we do with all of this data? Because it's now that we're able to collect even more, we have now more to analyze and determine what to do with and create plans in that way.
So as you mentioned, PROWAG has now been finalized in 2023. With any federal law, I feel like there's a revision every few years. Do we plan on, as professionals like yourself are actually, putting this in place and going off the last set of guidelines, do we expect in a couple of years another set to come out, or is it pretty solid?
We are not anticipating any revisions to PROWAG moving forward. Technically speaking, the DOJ has not fully adopted that, so they are still guidelines and they are not yet standards. But we all have to act as though they are because they could do that tomorrow and fully adopt those. I don't believe that we're going to see any changes to those guidelines. We might see further clarifications on, again, over the next 5 years, we all collectively look around and be like, there's this giant gaping hole and you guys don't address this at all. We need some guidance on how this is done. Either we as a community of professionals will decide this is how we address those things and we'll determine a solution that we all collectively decide and we'll just do that. Or maybe the the Access Board, the U.S. Access Board, who governs PROWAG, will say, hey, we agree, we're going to say that. Now, the Access Board can also give guidance without it being a new, fully adopted rule. They can just say, hey, here's a memo that states in this specific case, this is what we prefer to see,
Right.
And give us that guidance. So there might be some clarifications, but they have answered most of the big questions. Now it's just a matter of, well, there's these set of guidelines and these set of guidelines, and how do they overlap at my very unique instance, and being able to design those. And that's, as professionals, what we're hired to do. So that will be our challenge moving forward.
So with a lot of these complex situations, you're living in the gray.
Correct. You have to be comfortable knowing that, like, it used to be maybe 10, 15 years ago, the states have all issued standard details of, like, this is how we build things. And those details cover a lot of different state cases. But they had some that were addressed to curb ramps. And they said, here's how we build curb ramps. And as engineers, we're like, okay, just do it by the detail. And the contractors were like, this doesn't match any of those details that you gave me. I have no idea what to do here. So the onus flipped back onto the engineers, and even more so now that PROWAG has been fully adopted. The onus is on us as engineers to get it close. We then work with the contractors in the field because there are inevitably changes. We designed everything perfectly for this grade. They couldn't hit that. Okay, now the curb is this. How do we adopt?
That's awesome.
And figure things out from there.
So as we wrap up, what's one thing you wish every municipal leader understood about accessibility in the right of way?
I think I'd go back to that ADA transition plan. There is a shocking amount of communities that still don't have one. That was part of the original 1990 law that said they need to have one, and still they don't. I think we're seeing some nice pushes from municipal planning organizations. CMAP in the Chicago area is basically saying, we'll give you, either you're not going to be eligible for this funding as at a municipal level if you don't participate, or we're going to give you extra points if you have this thing that you should have had all along. So we are starting to see some communities not being forced, but being encouraged to participate in that way. So I would have loved more communities to do it on their own, because it is the right and proper thing to do for all of their citizens to have these plans and improve their processes. But whatever is the thing that gets it to get done, that's what we need to do. And those ADA self-evaluation plans, obviously they apply to those sidewalks and crosswalks and curb ramps and those things, but they also apply to your city hall. And is the bathroom compliant? Is the workspace compliant? Are they getting accommodations at meetings, et cetera? So seeing communities have plans that address all of those areas, that would be my request.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I've learned a ton. I appreciate it. Now when I'm walking down the sidewalk, I'll be paying attention as well. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thanks. That was interesting. I loved hearing about how, as design engineers, our team is taking an ADA transition plan and looking to see how it affects all parts. We're looking at the drainage structures. We're looking at crosswalks and sidewalks and the slope, and how everything put together is a complex puzzle. For our entire team here at Baxter Woodman, like, share, subscribe, and follow along. Have a great day.